Welcome to this webinar series, Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process. Smarter Balance partnered with WestEd to develop resources and professional learning tools to help educators adapt tools for teachers' resources for remote learning. This webinar has been recorded in 4 parts so that you can access them separately or watch them all together. Staff from WestEd, Andrea Browning, Jessica Arnold, Nancy Thomas Price, and me, Ruth McKenna, will be sharing the narration during this webinar. In the first part of the webinar, there is an introduction to the remote learning framework. Please have open or printed out the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework, Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process. Part 2 walks through the template named Planning for Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process. This template was developed as an organizer to adapt resources. Part 3 covers the process to adapt an ELA resource using the framework and the template. In Part 3, you will need the framework, the example ELA Grade 3 resource, Lessons from a Story, downloaded from the Tools for Teachers website, and the planning template filled in with the Grade 3 example. In Part 4, we will work together on a mathematics lesson. We use the framework, the example Grade 4 math resource, What's Your Angle, from Tools for Teachers, and the planning template filled in with a Grade 4 mathematics example. Please pause the webinar now to download the resources if you haven't already done so. All of these resources are available on Tools for Teachers. On the screen is the document to have downloaded or printed for this part of the webinar, Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework. I'd like to turn to Andrea Browning, who will share how the framework was developed.
Welcome to this webinar on using the formative assessment process in remote learning environments. My name is Andrea Browning, and I'll be leading part 1 of the webinar with my colleague Ruth McKenna. In part 1, we'll introduce you to the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework. We'll be walking you through the tool, so we recommend that you follow along with the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework document. Smarter Balanced created this framework for adapting instruction to the remote context to support educators with the abrupt shift to remote instruction because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Though the resource was developed in the context of fully remote instruction due to the pandemic, it was built to be useful in any combination of instructional models that includes some distance learning or remote learning instruction. We use the term remote learning to be inclusive of distance learning, digital learning, and other forms of teaching and learning that happen when students are not in the same place as their teacher. The framework was carefully developed to capture what research points to as the most critical components of effective remote learning. We then mapped these components to the formative assessment process, and then we thought through what remote instruction would look and feel like in practice. Once we had our initial framework in place, we sought feedback from educators to make sure it was intuitive to use when adapting Tools for Teachers resources from a classroom-based delivery model to the realities of instruction in the remote context. Now my colleague Ruth McKenna will talk you through some of what we learned from our research review.
A review of the literature related to remote learning was conducted in October and November of 2020. By that time, the experiences of shutdowns in spring 2020 had prompted extensive work by states, universities, nonprofits, and researchers to learn from the problems they had encountered and plan a better remote learning experience when schools started up again in the fall. There were many how-to and lessons learned guides for educators and numerous listings of technology tools to transition the in-classroom experience to remote learning. In addition to these resources, 3 large studies reviewing the literature about remote or distance learning related to teaching effectiveness, student engagement using social media and collaboration tools, and using the available technology provided a foundation for our work in developing the framework. Research has confirmed that good teaching, rather than the delivery format, is the primary factor for student success in both in-person and remote learning. A recent study of student engagement in classes that use social media and online collaboration tools found that students engage in 3 ways: behavioral engagement, where the student participates in the activity; emotional engagement, where the student has a positive or negative response to the activity; and cognitive engagement, where the student activates thinking and learning during the activity. While the first 2 types of engagement contribute to the student experience, cognitive engagement is important for accomplishing student learning. The other key findings across multiple studies are teachers and students use the technology that is familiar and available. Planning for the course of study must take into consideration the well-being of students, fellow teachers, families, and the community in the wake of the pandemic.
On the screen is page 1 of the framework, which gives you an overview of how to use this resource. Again, please reference the framework document as we explain and walk through the sections of the framework, how they relate to the formative assessment process, and how they are used to adapt tools for teachers' lessons. On pages 1 and 2, we overview the conditions for engaging students in remote learning, how to prioritize learning for the remote context, and the key considerations for teaching and learning. The conditions for learning are what we think of as the what of an ideal student experience, really in any learning environment, but in particular in a learning setting where engagement and connection are even more important, given the nature of missing out on some of the benefits of being in the same physical space as their teachers and peers. Our section on prioritizing learning for remote contexts recognizes that some lesson plans may not be well suited to a remote context, given the differences in how instruction and interaction work when students aren't in the same place. We'll walk you through how to consider what's most important to retain from a Tools for Teachers lesson. The key considerations for teaching and learning comprise the real how-to portion of adapting your material and lesson plan. In this section of the framework, we'll introduce what we refer to as the 3 domains for adapting instruction for remote learning within the context of the formative assessment process. I'll walk you through the conditions for engaging students first. Also on page 1 are what we consider the conditions for engaging students. Student engagement is essential for any learning delivery, and particularly important for successful remote learning. These conditions here really are about the look and feel of remote learning when students are engaged socially, emotionally, and intellectually. First, teachers should create a community of learners. Students will feel welcomed, and not that they're just tuning in, but really included in and playing a role in a learning community. Teachers also should recognize the personal assets that students bring as the foundation for learning. This is really about meeting students where they are and making sure that what they know how to do, as well as their personal knowledge and identities and their cultural and social assets, are recognized as the foundation for their learning. To promote student agency, we really know from the literature that student agency, or feeling empowered to drive and own their own learning, is a strong indicator of having a positive, affirming experience with learning. So when teachers promote student agency, students' interests and choices are present and prioritized, and students are supported to manage their own learning. To make thinking visible, we always want to be able to observe and understand the learning process for each individual student. This is harder to do in remote contexts, but in an engaging, responsive remote context, students have multiple opportunities and methods to make evidence of their thinking visible to teachers and to their peers. And then finally, to provide meaningful interaction with teachers and with peers, students will have multiple opportunities for meaningful interaction with teachers and their peers, both in real time, which is on synchronous tasks, and when they're working independently, which is on asynchronous tasks. This isn't just token interaction, but real chances to think with and build on their learning with others.
Page 2 of the framework looks at how to prioritize learning for the remote context. The Tools for Teachers lesson is usually designed for an in-person classroom. Current technology tools can simulate the in-person experience through video conferencing with breakout rooms and collaboration tools to share documents, chat, and respond to polls and quizzes. The time available to work with students synchronously versus the time allocated for asynchronous learning may equate to in-person class time and homework time, but it may not. Deciding the best use of the synchronous time available drives the focus of the lesson for remote learning.
We're now going to move into discussion of the key considerations for remote teaching and learning, which are what we earlier referred to as the 3 domains that describe what teachers need to do. On page 3 of the framework document, there's a graphic representation of the framework, which is what's on this slide. The outside cloverleaf represents the 4 components of the formative assessment process: clarify, elicit, interpret, and act. The circle in the middle of the graphic represents what teachers need to know and be doing to move through the formative assessment process in remote contexts. The key considerations inside the circle are the specific 3 domains of plan for engagement, instruct for equity, and design for learner well-being. We created this graphic to show that these teaching and learning considerations can be applied to all of the formative assessment stages. The 3 domains that make up the pieces of this pie articulate the intentional teacher actions that can support students to meet their learning goals. The teacher actions or moves within the 3 domains can be utilized in any part of the formative assessment process. If you're following along on the framework document, you'll see that for each domain, we also describe what the student experience looks like when the instructional strategies within each domain are utilized. Let's now talk through each of these domains. We'll talk about the steps in the formative assessment process as we discuss each of the domains. You can continue to refer to page 3 of the document. A few slides ago, I walked through the conditions for engaging students. So our first domain, plan for engagement, is really all about planning the right mix of instructional strategies to create these conditions based on the learning goals and success criteria for the particular lesson that you're adapting and delivering remotely. The second domain, instruct for equity, challenges the educator to consider how to adapt their teaching strategies so that the learning experience offers equitable ways for all students to engage, including through differentiation, making sure content and tools are fully accessible to all students, including students with disabilities and those with limited English proficiency, as well as considering if instruction is culturally responsive. The third piece of the pie, the domain of designing for learner well-being, brings in the things that teachers can do to make sure that instruction also prioritizes the health, safety, and well-being of individuals and of the collective. Some of the moves in this category include strategies to build student agency and to encourage community building. Before we walk through the application of the key considerations, let's do a quick review of the formative assessment process, and specifically what each stage might mean in a remote context. Clarify intended learning means that teachers determine and share learning goals, what students will learn, and success criteria, the evidence teachers and students will use to measure student progress toward those learning goals. In the elicit stage, teachers and students engage in learning experiences that generate flexible sources of evidence of learning aligned to the learning goals and success criteria. In the interpret stage, teachers and students review evidence to determine students' progress toward learning goals and success criteria. And finally, when acting on evidence of student learning, teachers and students respond to evidence of learning to determine what each student needs to do next to progress toward the learning goals and success criteria. The next several slides break down what might be different in each stage when learning is happening remotely. Let's begin with the first stage of formative assessment, clarify. This is on pages 4 and 5 of the framework document. What I'm going to do is share a few of the teacher actions aligned to each stage of formative assessment. Within each stage, I'll include a sample teacher action for each of the 3 domains. I won't cover all the things that teachers can do to adapt their teaching. I'll just share enough examples to give you a sense of what kinds of changes to your teaching might help with remote learning. I'm sure as I talk through some of the examples from our framework that you'll be able to think of additional adaptations too. So first, to plan for engagement in the clarify stage, teachers will want to communicate the role that students will have in their learning. For example, teachers might have students generate ideas for how they can share progress on the success criteria in a virtual setting. In the next domain, instruct for equity, Teachers need to identify student technology access constraints that might limit a student's ability to achieve the learning goals and success criteria. Examples would include ensuring electronic materials are accessible and mobile friendly, and providing call-in options for synchronous instructional time. To design for learner well-being, our third domain, teachers need to plan to include wellness habits that can support students to achieve the learning goals and success criteria. So, for example, by teaching and modeling healthy strategies for managing anxiety and stress, and maybe looking for pauses in the lesson to include movement and other wellness breaks. Let's move on to the next stage of formative assessment, elicit. For reference, this is on pages 6 and 7 of the framework document. To plan for engagement, teachers will want to use technology to elicit flexible sources of evidence in a remote learning context. An example of this would be to use technology strategically to support the in-process gathering of evidence of student learning, such as through polling applications like Mentimeter, Poll Everywhere, and Kahoot. To instruct for equity, evaluate whether remote teaching strategies disadvantage individuals or groups, or make it challenging to share evidence of their learning. For example, teachers will want to use multiple means to convey information to students, such as accompanying written instructions and explanations with short audio or video, or maybe images. And to design for learner well-being, the teacher actions include engaging students in sharing evidence of their learning in ways that support them to be self-directed learners. One way to do this is to utilize breakout rooms strategically for conferencing, small group discussions, and other partner work. The next stage in the formative assessment process is interpret evidence. We break down these teacher actions by domain on pages 8 and 9. A teacher action that helps plan for engagement is to create opportunities for students to develop metacognitive awareness skills that support the formative assessment process. An example of this would be to regularly prompt students to reflect on how they use their personal skills and resources to further their understanding. Teachers might do this through online tools like chat functions or message boards. To instruct for equity, teachers can evaluate student engagement and learning in ways that fully capture individual student needs, preferences, and experiences. This can look like looking for evidence of engagement in synchronous and asynchronous learning that goes beyond completed tasks, things like individual login analytics or maybe in progress work. And to design for learner well-being while interpreting evidence, teachers will want to identify opportunities to get to know students better, such as by integrating daily or weekly rituals, such as well-being reflections, into other checks for understanding. For example, you might use whiteboard applications like Jamboard for students to share images or words that reflect their status. And finally, let's preview some of the teacher moves for acting on evidence. This stage of the formative assessment process is on pages 10 and 11. To plan for engagement in a stage, teachers can provide regular feedback through multiple engagement strategies. For example, by explicitly teaching students how to use technology tools to offer effective peer feedback by modeling and providing scaffolds like sentence starters or graphic organizers. To instruct for equity, one of the actions teachers can take is to use technology to differentiate instruction based on evidence of student learning. This could look like determining how to best use breakout rooms and asynchronous collaboration tools to support individual student learning. And to design for learner well-being in the ACT phase of formative assessment, teachers can provide feedback that promotes student well-being. This might look like providing feedback that builds on students' cultural, linguistic, and experiential assets. As we close out, I'll just flag a couple of takeaways from this introduction to the framework. Based on what we know from research, meaningfully engaging students and attending to equity and the well-being of students improve the quality and experience of remote learning for students and for their teachers. The Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework guides teachers through the process of doing these three things as they use the formative assessment process in remote teaching. Tune into part 2 to be introduced to a template that you can use to adapt your lessons. In parts 3 and 4, we'll use this same template to walk you through how to adapt an ELA resource and a mathematics resource. Thanks for joining us today. This concludes part 1 of the webinar.
Welcome to part 2 of the webinar series, where we demonstrate how to use a planning template to adapt tools for teachers' resources for remote learning. In this section, we will show you how the template works with the framework and where you can make notes on the document to assist you in planning. I'm Ruth McKenna, and I'll guide you through the thinking behind the template and how to use it as an organizer to plan adjustments for remote learning. If you haven't already done so, please pause the webinar and download the blank template, Planning for Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process. The materials for this part of the webinar include the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework that we talked about in part 1, and the template, Planning for Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process. We will walk through how to use each of these documents to adapt tools for teachers' resources. We use the framework as a guide to build this template. The template supports educators to reflect on the conditions for engaging students, prioritize learning, and use key considerations in the 3 domains of engagement, equity, and well-being to adapt the resource activities. The template provides boxes for you to expand and type in your notes during each step of the process. Let's walk through the template together. On the screen is the first page of the template. In the first paragraph, there are links to the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework and the Tools for Teachers website. In the middle of the page, we list 3 steps for the process. And at the bottom of the left column is the place for you to type in the title, grade level, and content area of the resource. During parts 3 and 4 of the webinar, you will see templates that have been filled in to show examples of how to adapt a grade 3 ELA resource and a grade 4 mathematics resource. There are 3 steps in the process to adapt a Tools for Teachers resource. First, choose a resource from the Tools for Teachers website that aligns to the learning goals for your class. Next, review the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework to get ideas about how to enhance student engagement, equity, and well-being during the formative assessment process. Finally, apply the ideas from the framework to adjust the step-by-step activities described in the resource. Please keep in mind, the template is not intended to be prescriptive, but to serve as a guide to support your planning. We're going to walk through the template, but as we go, think through how you could use this in a way that supports your process. On page 2 of the template, in step 1, there are guiding questions to help you think about whether the activities in the Tools for Teachers resource are appropriate for a remote learning context. Next, in step 2, there are success criteria for reviewing and understanding the key ideas in the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework. Take a moment to think about your understanding of the key ideas in the framework and how you might collect evidence to meet the success criteria. Once you have become familiar with the Tools for Teachers resource, you will need to consider how this resource will work in a remote context. The first consideration is whether the fundamental elements of this lesson are feasible in a remote learning context. Also, consider whether your time, technology, or other constraints require you to adjust the learning goals and success criteria. Finally, you'll need to consider how to ensure the most essential learning in the lesson will have the most impact on students. Reflecting on these questions will help you prioritize critical content and make decisions as you adapt the lesson for a remote context. Look at page 3 of the template, and you might want to open the framework as well. Now that you have chosen the resource and decided that it is viable to adapt for remote instruction, this step in the process provides an opportunity for you to reflect on your students and to think about their needs as related to the conditions of engagement described in the framework. The reflection questions help you jot down notes about your students and think about areas where you might work on strengthening one or more of these conditions during the lesson. On the last page of the template, you have a place to take notes on the adjustments you will make to the lesson activities. You can expand the boxes and add as many rows as you need. On the left-hand side, you have space to copy and paste the summaries from the formative assessment process section of the Tools for Teachers resource to help you keep the key steps of the learning process in mind. On the right-hand side, you have spaces to jot notes on the adjustments you need to implement the lesson in a remote learning context. Here is the place to add descriptions of technology tools, steps to prepare digital materials, and notes to organize remote groupings. Please take a moment to review pages 4 through 11 in the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework to get ideas from the example teacher actions in each stage of the formative assessment process to enhance the conditions for students. We'll be able to work through this process together with example resources in parts 3 and 4 of this webinar series. As we close out, I'll just recap some takeaways from this introduction to the template. The template guides you through the process to adapt a resource using the conceptual model of the framework. The reflection sections help you make your thinking about your students and their needs visible. On page 4 of the template, you use the formative assessment process summaries to anchor your thinking about the lesson activities and possible ideas from the framework that will enhance the conditions for remote learning. You can expand the boxes and add rows as you work your way through the entire lesson. Up next is part 3, where we show how we adapted an example ELA resource. In part 4, we'll use the same template with a Math Tools for Teachers resource. Thanks for joining us today. This concludes part 2 of the webinar.
Hi, I'm Jessica Arnold from WestEd, and joining me in presenting the webinar today is my colleague, Ruth McKenna. Welcome to part 3 of the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process webinar. In this section, we will work together to use the planning template to adapt an ELA lesson as an example.
The materials for this part of the webinar include Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework from parts 1 and 2, Tools for Teachers Grade 3 ELA resource, Lessons from a Story, the step-by-step and attachments, Planning for Remote Learning Grade 3 ELA example. We will walk through how to use each of these documents to adapt a resource for remote learning using the ELA resource as an example. On screen, we're showing the Tools for Teachers landing page at smartertoolsforteachers.org. This is where you will start your search for resources. On Tools for Teachers, you'll find a variety of educator-created lessons, activities, strategies, and professional development to help tailor and boost learning. For our purposes today, you won't need to log in to use Tools for Teachers. We're going to use a resource that is publicly available to everyone to walk through how to use the template. In the Preview Resources box, select the resource Lessons from a Story, Grade 3 ELA.
For this example, we've selected a lesson called Lessons from a Story. This is a 3rd grade ELA resource, and it's available on Tools for Teachers without a login. Let's take a moment to get oriented to what you'll find in a Tools for Teachers lesson. This resource is divided into 3 sections. On the left-hand menu, there's an outline for the lesson with the headers for different sections of this resource. You'll find Get Started, Step by Step, Attachments, Accessibility Strategies that were used, Things to Consider, and Formative Assessment Process information. In the middle, you will find the contents of the outline, including attachments, an overview, instructional strategies, and step-by-step directions. Additionally, the formative assessment process is embedded throughout the lesson and is described in detail at the end of this column. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see the claim, target, and content standards for this lesson. In addition, there's a link to the Read Literary Texts Interim Connections playlist that includes this resource. Two very important sections to pay attention to in this planning process are the formative assessment process information and the step-by-step details.
For this part of the webinar, we'll be referring to the original Tools for Teachers resource, the example adaptation on the planning template labeled Grade 3 ELA, and Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework. Please pause the webinar if needed to organize these materials. Read through each section of the original Tools for Teachers resource, Lessons from a Story, as you would when you're preparing to use this resource in your classroom. Get Started has the learning goal and success criteria. Step by Step lists the activities in the order planned by the resource author. Attachments provide ready-made handouts and organizers. Accessibility strategies highlight accommodations and tools that may assist students with special needs. Things to consider describe options for the implementation of the activities. The formative assessment process summaries provide insight into how the teacher intends to take the students through all the steps in the process and collect evidence of learning. The site offers a tool for you to take notes as you review this section. It can be accessed by clicking on the paper pencil icon at the top right of the screen. You can also take notes on the step-by-step printout.
On the screen is page 1 of the Planning for Remote Learning and the Formative Assessment Process template with the Grade 3 ELA example. In this example, we have filled in the text boxes with possible content. Please keep in mind that these are just examples and are intended to prompt your own ideas about how you would approach adjusting the resource for remote learning in your own context. Now let's walk through page 2 of the example to show how we use the framework and the template to adapt our example ELA lesson. First, we reflected on the fundamental elements of the lesson and decided that the lesson would work in the remote setting given our online tools and other constraints. Next, we reviewed the lesson and reflected on the learning goals and success criteria. We decided that we don't need to make any adjustments to either of these to implement the lesson in the remote setting. Finally, we identified the most essential learning for this lesson to help guide our planning. Read our reflections on your downloaded copy of the example lesson.
Next, we made some plans about how the lesson could balance synchronous and asynchronous learning. Since this is grade 3 and the teacher needs to collect evidence of student understanding of the central theme by observation and strategic questioning, all of the activities in the lesson are conducted in synchronous sessions as either whole group sessions or breakout rooms with small groups. Keep in mind that decisions about synchronous and asynchronous learning will need to reflect your local context and district policies. This is just one example of how to approach the lesson. We begin step 3 by completing a reflection on the conditions for engaging students in a remote environment. The first question asks us to think about engagement conditions that are going well and those that are areas for growth in our current remote teaching practice. The second question asks us to reflect on how this lesson might provide an opportunity to strengthen one or more of these conditions. In this example, we identified some areas of focus, noting the need to support students who need assistance when they are reading in English. Please take a moment to read the reflections on the example lesson document you have downloaded.
On pages 4 and 5 of the ELA example, you will see a section called Lesson Preparation. This section provides a space to take note of the changes needed to prepare for the lesson, including changes to the materials and processes described in the step-by-step. On the next slide are examples of typical adjustments that might be needed for remote learning with online instruction. In this particular lesson, we used a variety of tools to support different student learning experiences and interactions. We provided examples of specific products, but we've tried to emphasize the interaction supported by the technology over any specific product or tool, since everyone has access to and familiarity with different tools. This lesson was adapted using online tools for whole group instruction, for example, Zoom or Google Meet, tools that facilitate breakout rooms. Often these are a part of the online meeting platform. Digital versions of assigned materials, classroom management tools that allow students to access digital materials and turn in assignments. Examples might be Google Classroom or Seesaw, and ways to collaborate to share feedback, like a chat box, Google Docs, Jamboard, or Padlet.
In the ELA example, the summaries of the formative assessment process provided in the resource are pasted into the template in the left column. In this example, the step-by-step section titles reflect the formative assessment process stages. In other resources, the formative assessment process summaries show how more than one stage of the formative assessment process may be included in a single section of the lesson. Once you have decided how to adjust the activities for remote learning in the column on the right, it's time to refer to the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework, pages 4 to 11. On these pages, you will see the teacher actions described for engagement, equity, and well-being for each stage of the formative assessment process. Add in ideas to the right column to enhance the planned activities that may be prompted from your earlier reflection about your students' needs. Take a pause in the webinar to read through the entire ELA example and jot down thoughts about how the example makes connections between the formative assessment process and the domains of engagement, equity, and well-being. To adapt this ELA lesson, it was easy to transition from in-person learning to online learning with common collaboration tools and video conferencing. Where the original lesson engaged in whole group presentations and discussions, the adapted lesson used a video meeting platform and the chat and whiteboard functionality. To support the small group discussions where students work together on assigned stories, we send students to breakout rooms with their small groups. Instead of offering handouts, we provided digital folders with different stories for each group based on the student reading levels. The original lesson had students highlight evidence in their stories, and the adapted lesson uses online highlighting tools to support this. And in the adapted lesson, to provide opportunities for strategic questioning that were part of the original lesson, we used teacher visits to the breakout rooms to provide this same opportunity. We made some additional modifications to support students to meet the learning goals and success criteria. When we reflected about student needs on page 3 of the planning template, we focused on students who needed assistance with reading English. That influenced the composition of the small groups, assignment of stories, and the specific teacher actions from the framework we incorporated into the adapted lesson. The steps of the lesson were maintained as in the original. However, when there was a think, pair, share, we substituted responses through the chat feature to give the teacher quick access to student responses. The independent work was done in asynchronous time, and students submitted the highlighted stories to the collaboration site for the teacher to review and share with the whole class. The monitoring engagement of the teacher with students in breakout rooms offers the best opportunity for students to get important feedback from the teacher and their peers on their group discussion skills and their analysis of the stories. In this example, the teacher visits each group to collect evidence of learning for each student and to note the progress of students who need help with reading English. You can see these changes in detail in the example lesson.
Before we go, we'd like to highlight 3 takeaways about adapting this ELA example resource for remote learning. The Tools for Teachers resource already includes the key information you need to make adjustments for teaching in a remote context. The planning template helps guide an educator through the process to think about how to adapt the resource for remote learning, but it's not intended to be prescriptive. The template is designed to help you keep the ideas from the remote learning framework, including engagement, equity, and well-being, in mind while you plan your lesson. Next, in part 4, we adapt a mathematics lesson using the same template. Thanks for joining us today. This concludes part 3 of the webinar.
My name is Nancy Thomas Price from WestEd. I will be joined in this part of the webinar by my colleague, Ruth McKenna. In part 4, we guide you through an example of how to use the remote learning template with a Tools for Teachers Grade 4 math resource titled, What's Your Angle? We won't go through the specifics in the lesson line by line in this webinar. Viewers are able to do that using the Grade 4 math example document aligned to this lesson. The images on the screen are to signal the sections to which we are referring. So let's get started.
We suggest that you download and print out the materials needed for this webinar so that you can take notes on the documents for future reference. The materials include the Smarter Balanced Remote Learning Framework, the Tools for Teachers Grade 4 math resource, What's Your Angle, on the Tools for Teachers website. Refer to the step-by-step directions and lesson attachments, and the Planning for Remote Learning Grade 4 Math example document. We will walk through how to use each of these documents in the process of adapting a resource for remote learning.
On the screen, we're showing the Tools for Teachers landing page at smartertoolsforteachers.org, which is where you will find the lesson we are going to focus on in this example. What's Your Angle? A Grade 4 math lesson. On Tools for Teachers, you will find a variety of educator-created lessons, activities, strategies, and professional development resources to help tailor and boost learning. For our purposes today, you won't need to log in to use Tools for Teachers. You can use the site as a visitor. We are going to use a resource that is readily available to everyone. In the Preview Resources box, select the What's Your Angle? Resource. As I mentioned, this 4th grade math lesson is available on Tools for Teachers without logging in. Let's take a moment to get oriented to what you'll find in this Tools for Teachers resource. The resource is divided into 3 sections. On the left-hand menu, there is an outline for the lesson with the headers for different sections of the resource. Get started, step by step, attachments, accessibility strategies used, things to consider, and formative assessment process information. In the middle, you will find the contents of the outline, including attachments, an overview, instructional strategies, and step-by-step directions. Additionally, the formative assessment process is embedded throughout the lesson and is described in detail at the end of this column. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see the claim, target, and content standard alignment for this lesson. In addition, there is a link to the Measurement and Data Interim Connections playlist that suggests using this resource for the content assessed in the interim assessment block. 2 very important sections to pay attention to in this planning process are the formative assessment process information and the step-by-step details.
Now is a good time to pause the webinar to organize your materials if you haven't already. Download the original Tools for Teachers resource with attachments and print out the pages if you prefer to work from hard copies. Read through each section of the original Tools for Teachers resource as you would when preparing to use this lesson in your classroom. Get Started has the learning goal and success criteria. Step by step, list the activities in the order planned by the resource author. Attachments provide ready-made handouts and advanced organizers. Accessibility strategies highlight accommodations and tools that may assist the students with special needs. Things to consider describe options for implementation of the activities. The formative assessment process summaries provide insight into how the teacher intends to take the students through all the steps in the process and collect evidence of learning. The Tools for Teachers website offers a note-taking tool for you to take notes as you review the resource. It can be accessed by clicking on the paper pencil icon at the top right of the screen. You can also take notes on the step-by-step printout.
On the screen is the first page of the planning template we used for this math example. We have started to complete the information as we are guided to do so. Read your downloaded document where we have filled in the text boxes with possible content. These are just examples and are intended to prompt your own ideas about how you would approach adjusting the resource for remote learning. Reference page 2 of the math lesson annotation document. This is step 1 in which we reviewed the resource. These are our responses to the 3 initial questions in the What's Your Angle resource. Are the fundamental elements, such as instructional strategies, step-by-step activities of this lesson, feasible in the remote learning context? Yes, we think so. All the elements of this lesson are feasible using online classroom collaboration tools, response tools, and mathematics tools. Do the learning goals and success criteria need to be adjusted? We don't think so. All students will be able to complete the 3 learning goals. However, the first learning goal has been integrated throughout the lesson, as opposed to being offered as a specific learning activity in order to prioritize application and to accomplish the lesson given the time constraints. No adjustments are needed to the success criteria. And for the last question, what is the most essential learning in this lesson, and which activities will have the most impact in the remote learning context? We feel that learning to divide and measure angles with known and unknown measurements is the most essential learning. We begin step 3 by completing a reflection on the conditions for engaging students in a remote environment. First question asks us to think about engagement conditions that are going well and those that are areas for growth in our current remote teaching practice. The second question asks us to reflect on how this lesson might provide an opportunity to strengthen one or more of these conditions. In this example, we identified some areas to focus on, noting the need to gather evidence. We want to ensure that students feel welcomed and included and are engaged in the learning experiences. We're going to offer students the opportunity to lead small group discussions, starting with those who are most comfortable doing so, and establishing this as a routine for our class. Please take a moment to read the reflections on the example math lesson document you downloaded. On page 4 of the mathematics example document, we review and make decisions about preparation for remote learning needed in advance of the lesson. In the second column, we note adaptations to the lesson preparation for this resource in our remote context. There are some adaptations needed. Not only do we need to gather materials students will need, but we will need to set up our online meeting platform in advance and plan for breakout groups. We need to update the PowerPoint slides that are included with this resource so the PowerPoint reflects remote learning adaptations. We need to prepare a handout for the warm-up activity, which we have decided to combine into one activity instead of 2. In lesson preparation, we note opportunities for addressing equity. We build in choices for students to submit their work, and we allow multiple options for students to put together the materials they will need. We had to rethink our remote exit ticket submission in advance and plan for using a tool like Padlet, Flipgrid, or similar to complete the exit ticket. Students will need the same materials in their remote environment as they would need in a classroom: paper, pen, or pencil, and a protractor. For students that do not have a protractor, we provide instructions to them about how to use an online protractor or print one on paper. In this particular lesson, a variety of tools were used to support different student learning experiences and interactions. We provided examples of specific products, but we've tried to emphasize the interactions supported by the technology, since everyone has access to and familiarity with different tools. This lesson was adapted using whole group and small group instruction using online video meetings that allow for breakout rooms, such as Zoom or Google Meet, paying attention to our math content activities and what will work best. Digital versions of the assigned materials, such as a Word document or PDF, emailed to students or shared in an online platform such as Google Docs. A classroom platform that will allow students to turn in assignments remotely, like Google Classroom or Seesaw, and ways to collaborate and to share feedback verbally and in writing, like a chat box, Google Doc, Jamboard, or Padlet. On page 5 of our document, we use column 1 to focus on the steps in the formative assessment process and look for places to adapt the activities of this lesson while considering how we will clarify learning and elicit evidence of learning. In column 2, we note the adaptations. The learning goals and success criteria are on the PowerPoint provided with this activity, which we will share on screen for our students. We note the importance of reviewing all the materials with students at the beginning of the lesson. Also noted is the emphasis on encouraging students to engage in aspects of the lesson and discussions in ways they prefer. We want students to share their thinking using the mathematics vocabulary we reviewed in the warm-up activity, in spoken and in written work. We model how to use online math tools, such as the protractor and other remote learning tools. Please pause the webinar to read through the example mathematics lesson document. Note the places we have had to make adaptations using various technology tools and the choices about when it is best for students to work together or independently. Think about what activities lend themselves to synchronous or asynchronous work. In summary, adapting this math lesson required focus on making sure students were engaged and had the right materials and tools for learning. Lesson preparation took a bit more time as we had to set up our meeting platform, plan for small group breakouts, and ensure students had access to all the necessary tools. The warm-up activity was scaled back to reduce time, but we still needed to ensure students knew the vocabulary well enough to use it correctly. Additional review of student materials and modeling was necessary. For our 3 progressive activities, construct, then decompose angles, and finally find unknown angles, additional scaffolding and opportunities for engagement were built in. When live in a classroom, a teacher can walk around and casually observe and talk to students, but we had to build in more opportunities to check for understanding in ways that consider the remote nature of teaching and learning. Wrapping up the math lesson, let's look at key takeaways. Our math lesson required that we look closely at the content of the lesson to provide online math tools and use careful decision-making about small and large groups, as well as the use of synchronous or asynchronous time. The remote learning framework and the blank planning template can serve as a guide to thinking about adjusting instruction for a remote learning context. In addition to planning the mechanics of online teaching and learning, it is important to focus on how you can support engagement, equity, and well-being. Please use the example lessons to get ideas about adapting your own lesson. Different teachers will have different ways they go about these adaptations. Before we end today, We want to remind you that many resources, lessons, and tools can be accessed using your Tools for Teachers logon. We have adapted 2 additional lessons to give you more ideas about adapting to a remote learning context: a grade 5 English Language Arts lesson and a grade 7 mathematics lesson. Thanks for joining us today. This concludes part 4 of the webinar.
Thank you for your participation in the webinar. Keep in mind that Tools for Teachers resources provide all the information you need to teach the lessons remotely or in person in a classroom. We hope you found this webinar and these resources helpful. These professional learning resources can be a springboard for you and your colleagues to make Tools for Teachers resources work for you in remote learning settings. Check out Tools for Teachers today.